right, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here. My name is Carl Pearson. I am the Assistant Director at the Center for the Study of the Middle East, as we call it Sesame. And on behalf of the Themester program at IU and the IU Center for the Study of the Middle East, welcome to our lecture today with Professor Nazif Shahrani. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, but before I do, two quick technical notes. After the talk, Professor Shahrani has agreed to answer questions and respond to your comments. If you would like to ask a question, please write the word question or even just the letter Q in the chat box, and we will call on you and unmute you in turn. And secondly, if you would like to be added to the Sesame email list, feel free to email me. You can see my email address there next to my name in my box, pearsonc@iu.edu. Professor Shahrani has appointments in Central Eurasian Studies, the Department of Anthropology, and the Middle Eastern Languages and Cultures Department here at IU, and has spent a career thinking and writing about anthropology, Afghanistan, and Central Asia more broadly. His early ethnographic studies focused on a Kyrgyz community in Badakhshan region of Afghanistan, but he's also spent much of his life and career thinking about the myriad and often violent transitions that Afghanistan has gone through: the coming of the communist regime in 1978, direct Soviet military intervention, the rise and ultimate victory of the Afghan Mujahideen, the civil wars in the 1990s and the rise of the Taliban, and the invasion by the American-led forces in 2001. He's also given serious thought to the effect of Islam on the social imagination, on the present and future of Afghanistan, and the ways in which anti-Islamic policies of post-Soviet Central Asian states have fueled Muslim militancy. So it is an honor to have Professor Shahrani with us today to give a lecture entitled "How and Why Democracy by War Produced a Kleptocracy in Afghanistan." Professor Shahrani.
Hey, salam alaikum to everybody and good afternoon. It's really a pleasure, after being cooped up here since March and not getting much out, to see some of the faces that are familiar with I have not seen for some time. This presentation, I had planned to talk a great deal about Afghanistan, but I decided not to. Instead, I'm going to talk about war, and from anthropological perspective, and also I don't want to make Afghanistan an exception. It isn't. It certainly has its own exceptionality, that it has been one country in modern history that has been in war since 1978. It's going to be 41 years. It has hijacked my career and hijacked a lot of other people's lives in ways that we could not have imagined. But it's a war that the one that we're really going to be talking about is the last 20 years or 19 years of American involvement. But in fact, America has been involved from the very start of the war in Afghanistan. From about 1979 on, America was deeply involved, but in a hidden way, until 2001. And 2001 has become, of course, the war that America has launched, recognized, and everybody talks about it is America's longest war. I'm going to offer a few facts and figures in, see if I can share screen and what is that? I don't know this very well. Uh-oh. Can this be done on this? I couldn't put it on the screen, but somebody can put it on the screen. Sorry. What happened? There we go. I'm not going to talk about these facts too much. I just want you to take a look at them and remember while I talk about some of the major issues. America went to this war essentially claiming that it was going to secure America from global terror. That was the claim. But it was justified for the Afghans anyway, after knocking the Taliban out, that America was going to bring peace, establish stability, and democracy and development in Afghanistan. Those were promises made repeatedly and particularly articulated in the Bonn Agreement, which has been the sort of the foundation of much of what has happened since then. That is the conference in Bonn that brought one side of the conflict, the Northern Alliance people, into the picture, and their opponents, the Taliban, whom the United States dislodged from power, were essentially ignored, not brought into the table for discussion. And then they brought a bunch of people in the name of supporters of the monarch, the old monarch or monarchy, and they brought up a group of people who were supported by Iran or were pro-Iran into the picture in Bonn, and then some who were supported by Pakistan, and they were supporters of Pakistan. So the four groups that got together under American auspices also spelled out these particular attempts that peace and independence, sovereignty of Afghanistan, development, good governance, and so forth would be essentially the objective or the goal of America being there. And it's fascinating that a book was written by a group of RAND researchers in around 2010, 2011 or so. The date is not clear in the information I have, but it's called After the War, Nation Building from FDR to George W. Bush. And the main author is James Dobbins, the man who was the first American ambassador to Afghanistan, plus Poole, Long, and Runkle. Those are other researchers who have done this. And it's very interesting that this is a book really about nation building in Afghanistan and Iraq. They try to explain why America early on, even 10 years ago, had failed or was failing. And the explanation there was that American approach initially in Afghanistan was a coordination and collaboration of various US institutions under CIA. CIA essentially went into Kabul, into Afghanistan with a couple of hundred soldiers on the ground and mobilized their supporters inside Afghanistan with sacks full of dollars. And they had the support of the Defense Department, who did the fighting, of course, through B-52s. And of course, State Department was there, Treasury was there, Commerce was there, everybody. So they're basically touting that the initial success in Afghanistan in the war was because America came together. America's institutions came together, coordinated themselves, and allowed CIA to run the thing. And then once it was done, they essentially let everybody go and let Defense Department essentially run the war and manage the country. So their explanation is that it was this decision to essentially give everything over to the Defense Department of the United States was the cause of the later sort of unsuccessfulness and so on and so forth. So this sort of brings us back to this question of the war. And the war, of course, has spent depending on how you look at the figures I'm putting here for you to look at is coming essentially from the Cost of War project at Brown University, which is run by a couple of anthropologists led by Catherine Lutz, whom I know and is a fine colleague who has done a lot of good work. So these are their numbers that around $2 trillion has been spent so far in the war in Afghanistan, and the cost will go a lot more. And what are the dividends of this war? You know, wars, as we'll see, are considered to have dividends. And the dividends for a long time was quite good and positive, as you will see, but for certain parts of the world and certain participants in wars, not necessarily to everybody. The one thing that the war dividend has brought about, and it's, I think, crystallizing, is that the very enemy they defeated in Afghanistan is being strengthened in ways that nobody could imagine. Taliban today is recognized essentially as a political force. In fact, constructed and presented to the Afghans is an alternative political force, which is an irony. And we have gone there to destroy them and get rid of them and all the rest. Yet what we have done, the dividend has been sometimes actually, I don't know if you're listening very carefully to when President Trump talks about the war in Afghanistan and Taliban, that he thinks they are now his partners for fighting the global terror, which is, as odd as you can imagine, but that's one of the things they're saying. So they see that as a dividend rather than a negative thing. And of course, the other thing that was not there, and I grew up in Afghanistan, and in fact, I participated in the cultivation of poppies when I was a young boy in the village. It was not a problem. It was a product. It was agricultural product for peasants to make a few Afghanis of cash, and then even have some oil extracted from the poppy seeds to cook their meals. And it had a lot of multiple functions, but it wasn't a problem. It was a product. Now it has become a huge problem after spending, as we'll see, huge amounts of, in fact, trillions, $10 billion on it. It is Afghanistan's major problem, as you can see. The only thing that they have done, of course, is they have killed a lot of people, but they killed bin Laden. And that did not happen for 10 years. They killed him in 2011. And then, of course, the ghastliest thing, of course, you can see that has happened in the country is that poverty in the country has gotten worse. Now, they're talking about 80% of the population of Afghanistan earning less than $2 a day, or living on $2 a day. And that's the level of poverty defined in Afghanistan. And of course, we should have had stable government, but repeatedly, every government by elections has gotten essentially more problematic in terms of democratic procedures or outcomes. We had 7 million people participate in the elections in 2004, the first elections. 9 million, in fact, the first for the presidential election. It went down to 7 million in 2005 for the parliamentary elections. By 2009, it was down to 4,000, 5,000. By this year that we had an election in 2018, less than 1.5 million people participated in the elections, and the man who was declared a winner had won less than 900,000 votes. So you can see even the procedural democracy is in shambles. It doesn't amount to anything, and much of that has to do with the fact that people have become disheartened and disillusioned, and they find what has been done to them is deceptive. It has been a bunch of lies and deceptions. And of course, you have to remember that last year we saw a series of 6 major exposés in Washington Post about the fact that the United States government has deceived the American citizens about this war in Afghanistan as well. And of course, the result of really what we have in Afghanistan is literally a bunch of thieves running the country. And it has been described as thugocracy as well as a kleptocracy. There's a bunch of thugs, basically. And much of this has to do with what America's major policy, and that is the militarized policy. Militarized foreign policy is really the culprit for much of what has happened. America has essentially made war is the first thing to turn to in its foreign relations, not the last means for settling problems around the world or even here within the country. You remember the riots or the demonstrations after George Floyd's death. The administration has been wanting to deploy the army to go out and crush these demonstrations calling for justice. So America's preoccupation with war is something that needs to be, I think, investigated. Unfortunately, it hasn't. But in America's policy, foreign policies in the Middle East, not just Afghanistan, throughout the Middle East, and in Africa and elsewhere, is also essentially based on warfare. There are indications that at this moment, there are 80 different countries in which the United States actually fights wars against the so-called terrorism. 80 countries. So Afghanistan is not the only one. Afghanistan was the one where it started, but it has been expanded and expanded, and now 80 countries where the American military is present in fighting the war. And of course, much of these wars have been in name of democracy, that they are promoting democracy. It's a democracy project, essentially, via wars and via bombardment. The question is why all these promises have not panned out, that there is nothing really much to show for it. And this is what I want to turn to for the rest of the time that we have. That maybe the war was conceived and understood, and the dividends that it provided for Western societies for a very long time have essentially stopped working, at least not for others. It still is, as I'll argue, it still is giving dividends to the West. But the war that they're waging in the rest of the world are not providing the same dividends that was expected of wars to have accomplished and will supposedly accomplish into the future. And in some ways, we will have to sort of consider whether war is a means for the kinds of positive dividends that it had delivered in the 19th century, 20th century, may not be, in fact, deliverable. It has become obsolete, perhaps, in the 21st century, in whether that should be looked at differently. So let me now read some of the stuff that I have looked into. Anthropology of war has produced enormous amount of literature because anthropologists were very, very interested in less complex societies, in the role of warfare in those societies and its impact gradually in more complex societies. In 1988, Ferguson and Farragher produced a volume called The Anthropology of War, a bibliography. This bibliography is 360 pages long. It's literature on war. And much of this has to do, again, with the early societies and the war's impact on them. But Ferguson also says there has been considerable upsurge in anthropological interest in the war that is now 40 years ago. And I think it continues to some extent, although we don't really talk about it. And the reason, he says, why anthropologists have been interested in war is it is a contemporary problem threatening all of mankind. We're not thinking about it. In fact, it's kept away from our vision and our views. But in fact, wars are considered by a lot of anthropological literature is something threatening humankind. Interestingly, Jonathan Hauss, whom you probably know, he was at SSRC and some of the other places, a very well-known author, wrote a working paper called Warfare and the Evolution of Culture, in which he says, the war is the biggest single threat to survival of humanity on the face of the planet. That was his assessment. Again, this one was written in 1998, this particular piece. And it is true that wars have been destructive, but wars have also contributed to the rise of contemporary modern Western industrialized societies. The potential risk to humanity as a whole, especially of a nuclear war, cannot be denied. However, the negative effects of conventional wars, especially since World War II, have been consistently worse for non-Western societies while benefiting the industrialized West. It is therefore critical for our purposes to essentially look at this enigmatic role of warfare in human societies, which has dramatically changed again since World War II, and what its role might be in the new millennia. How and what impact could war have into the future? It also has the impact of war has changed. I mean, the question that needs to be raised is whether the impact of war has changed for all societies. Just a second. So the question is whether the war's impact has been the same for all societies, or some societies are still benefiting a great deal more. Particularly, one has to look into whether warfare has done any good for Muslim societies with which we are concerned, and Afghanistan is part of that particular community. So let me turn into looking at what the literature says about the impact of war and warfare on Western societies. And then we will turn to the rest of the world. Gabriel Kolko wrote a book in 1994. It's called Century of War: Politics, Conflicts, and Societies Since 1914. And in that particular, he was asked later on whether, he called essentially 20th century of war. They asked him whether 21st century will be also a century of war. And his answer is yes, it's very likely that 21st century will be also a century of war. He notes that incredibly destructive 20th century wars fought amongst industrialized nations were characterized by symmetry. The symmetry is that industrialized societies faced each other. Each of them produced their own war machines. They mobilized their own people. They produced everything that the warfare required by themselves, and they stood and they fought. And of course, the results were disastrous, especially World War I and World War II on top of that. And what also they're saying is that the first war, World War I, was in fact the cause or the basis for fighting the Second World War. In other words, one war bred the other. And nationalism, of course, has a great deal to do with all of this. And one of the things that has happened recently in the United States, particularly also in Europe, is commemoration of these wars. There was a commemoration of Civil War not too long ago. And then the Vietnam War, all this war, that war, the other war. And there's been a lot of reflections about what these wars did to societies, and considerable amount of literature exists there. In one of those commemorative volumes entitled War, What is it good for? With a question mark, Conflict in Progress Civilization from Primates to Robots, is written by an archaeologist, Ian Morris. He says war is hell, but also claims over the long run, war has made humanity safer and richer. So war is producing wealth, producing order, producing governance, better organized societies. And of course, he is also claiming that in fact, violent deaths have become less in terms of ratio. Now, that's, it's something that you can argue with, but that's one of his claims. He also suggests wars have been principal means of developing government, that is state building and war has gone hand to hand. And states have reduced the war and death by violence during the 20th century, even in the Great Wars. They claim proportionately, if you compare this with earlier human societies, that these death threats are fewer. Over millennia, Morris insists war has resulted in peace and destruction has created wealth, concluding that the war has been good for something. So good, in fact, he contends, that war is now putting itself out of business. Don't we wish that it would, but in fact, it isn't so. Further, he claims in our own age, humanity, not just the Western civilized states, has gotten so good at fighting, our weapons so destructive, our organization so efficient, that war is beginning to make further war of this kind impossible. But this is maybe true of Europe, in America, but it is not true of the rest of the world, as one can see. The war dividend claimed by Ian Morris, however, may have been true only as long as warring societies were producing and using their own technologies of war domestically. That is, weapons, materials, communication infrastructure, organization, and mobilization, all of them was done by the people who were actually involved in the actual war. Technological advancement was gradual, incremental, and these things indeed came into being, and it helped societies transform. However, the conditions began to change radically for much of the non-Western societies with the rise of industrial revolution, industrialization, wars, and colonial expansion by Europeans. So once Europeans came with this technology of war, and they took it to the rest of the world, essentially, they turned war machinery to make lots of money and lots of profits and dividends. But who suffered? The people who were being colonized, as we all are familiar with. So the whole notion of total war in the 20th century that consumed so much of Western Europe and America, of course, went as an invited guest, essentially, towards the end in 1917. But the idea is that the war had a lot of dividends, positive ones, for the Western societies. In another commemorative volume by Drew Faust, which was published in 2015, and was given as a ready lecture in Cambridge, I think it was called Two Wars of a Long 20th Century, affirms that warfare, like the society that produced it, has become industrialized. In other words, the war, industrialization produced essentially the industrialization of societies as well as industrialization of war. And of course, that meant the outcome of industrial war was far greater butchery of humanity, particularly in the First World War. And of course, part of the reason they said industrialized war made war essentially war of the unseen, that people should shoot and drop bombs and artillery to people that they can see. It's anonymous. It's just this anonymity that added to the brutality, because the people who are in combat don't see each other. They don't feel, they don't know anything. And of course, all of that has gotten worse with digitalized world of modern day, where these drones are essentially killing people by push of a button, and nobody sees. And in fact, there is nobody to see, even on the drone from which the weapon is being shot at or dropped. And of course, there was plenty of philosophizing along the way in the 20th century, that America was called to be essentially the 20th century was to be American century. And in fact, it has proven to be that it is an American century. And America also, of course, came up or supported, promoted, I should say, sorry, these 20th century wars also had their own political religions that they produced. And these were liberalism, communism, and fascism, and of course, capitalism along with it. That these were ideologies that also were, or in aid of which, or for the realization of which, war was employed. War became a vehicle for promoting these kinds of political religions. So I call them political religions. They are ideologies that we're all familiar with, and what it did, or what they have done to human societies. George Kennan, who wrote about the so-called the Great War, meaning World War I, says he calls it the great seminal catastrophe of the 20th century, who, according to Faust, as I earlier indicated, was the seed for Second World War, also for communism, Nazism, Holocaust, and the gulags. That all of them, in fact, are related to that great seminal catastrophe, which was the First War. As such, World War I is regarded as a historical watershed, which permanently and drastically altered the Western world's entire relationship to war. World War I combined conscription as a novel means of mobilization of mass armies with industrial firepower, together with the fighting power and staying power that nationalism could generate. The reliance on citizens in 19th century wars, both in battle and at home front, helped sustain the conflicts, which in turn resulted in the emergence of new conception of citizenship and its privileges, which affected both the living and the dead. The violence of American Civil War interpreted an age that saw itself as one of the growing benevolence and humanitarianism, introducing a startling awareness of man's capacities for destruction that found its terrible fulfillment between 1914 and 1918. The transformative impacts of wars, not limited to the soldiers who fought in the wars, but in the whole of America and European societies. And of course, here we're talking about changes that came about for women and gender relations, gender rights, and eventually even the claim of suffrage, which came in the United States far later, and later compared to Europe. But in fact, if it was not for wars, the woman in the West probably would have fallen way back in terms of claiming their rights for a very long time. So the war provided, or produced, I should say, these kinds of major social transformations in Western societies. And of course, the introduction of photography, film, and a lot of major writers, even in the West, like Whitman, Beers, Melville, Emily Dickinson, all of them wrote about war. And their writings also sensitized people about the war. We don't get these kinds of writings anymore about the war in Afghanistan. There's produced virtually no literature that actually sensitize anybody about what's going on, because nobody sees it. And all the other wars in Africa and everywhere else. So it was the Western war, American war, European wars that produced these major literature that to a large extent sensitized. Also, I don't know how many of you have watched this marvelous documentary. It's called The Fog of War, which is essentially about McNamara, Robert McNamara in the Vietnam War, which is a phenomenal piece of, again, sensitizing people about the horrors of war, which we don't see. We don't even cover these wars in Afghanistan, Middle East, and so forth very much in the United States. In Vietnam, they used to bring the coffins. Every day you saw coffins arriving with American flag in news programs and shown. And of course, in the Afghan war, Iraq war, and so forth, it was stopped. Americans can't even see them. And of course, there was draft earlier on, and now it's voluntary army. So people, sign up for money and for benefits and so on and so forth, so that they can get away with not covering those kinds of things. So the dividends of war include transformative changes in attitudes and assumptions, including controversies regarding discontinuity and rapture caused by war. And of course, in the these issues were considered, really, these are becoming fundamental part of the modern society and modern civilization. And the language of disillusionment that were used in the poetry and so forth with war and so on, much of that really has been limited to the Western societies. So literature produced and sensitivities produced and so forth are kept within the Western societies. So if the dividends of war for the Western industrialized colonizers have been effective governance, peace, prosperity, progress, modernity, leading to enhanced civil rights and changed social consciousness, what has been the impact of these wars for colonial, anti-colonial, revolutionary, liberation, internecine, factional, civil, or proxy wars, and more recently countries in insurgency and counter-terrorist wars? What has been, all of these wars have been in fact fought outside of Europe and outside of America. So the question is, what has been the impact of these wars in other places? And this is where I'm going to turn for a little while to what has been the relationship or the impact of war on society in the rest of the world, not just in the West, but in the rest of the non-Western societies and countries. Harvard historian Andrew Bacevich, in an interview with HistoryNet in 2012 about the role of 20th century wars, stated, "War was bad news for the world, but on balance, good news for America." The impact of modern technologized war for the colonized and vanquished non-Western world, especially on state and societies in the Muslim Middle East, North Africa, Central and Southwestern Asia since the early 19th century, while for the most part, nothing but disasters, has not been systematically and critically investigated so far. The non-Western societies, their territories, human and natural resources have been targeted for control, extraction, and exploitation by competing nations of Europe and Russia, which waged industrialized wars in pursuit of their own national, economic, political, military interests in these geostrategic regions. The overwhelmingly superior industrial war technologies of the European and Russian colonizers occupied, destabilized, penetrated, and controlled Muslim societies, rendering them unable to produce effective war technologies of their own to defend themselves, as they had done so far for millennia during the pre-industrial wars against their foes near and far. They came to be constructed discursively by means of what Spivak calls epistemic violence is the other of Europe in the West. And something, of course, that all of you are familiar with, Edward Said's Orientalizing is the other term that has been used. In order to fight even their own anti-colonial wars of liberation, non-Western societies, including Muslim Middle East and Central Asia, became completely dependent on buying or otherwise acquiring Western industrial technologies of war, often procuring their older, less effective weapons in large quantities. Even after gaining their independence, the dependency of neo-post-colonial nation states broadened and deepened upon their former colonial masters or the United States of America. After Second World War, the newly emerging forms of capitalist and socialist empires of trust, or empires by invitation, I call them, headed by the United States and Soviet Union, forcefully and systematically peddled technologies of war, including weapons, communication equipment, organizations, and training, and sponsored oppressive regimes, as well as spreading subversive political ideologies or religious ones to the newly independent states in false promises of effecting modernization and socioeconomic development. The non-Western post-colonial societies, while destabilized and often traumatized by uses and abuses of war technologies, could not and did not reap any of the positive transformative dividends of the war enjoyed by the Western producers of war, is outlined above. That is, the post-colonial world order, the non-Western societies became consumers of war, arguably consumed by war. In the new power ecology of this wretched earth of ours, no amount of suffering and bloodshed guaranteed freedom and liberty for non-Western and largely Muslim societies of the East. It doesn't matter how vicious the wars, it did not bring freedom. In the old days, it was supposedly, if you fought hard, if you persisted and did, you would get liberty, you would get freedom. But that is no longer true. The colonial, anti-colonial wars of 19th and 20th centuries, for the most part, led to creation of many new multi-ethnic nation states, often intentionally divided ethno-linguistic and sectarian communities by colonialists who arbitrarily imposed national boundaries based on the old adage of divide and rule. And most of the new countries were even named by the colonizers, usually after the name of one of the many ethno-linguistic groups whose elites served the best interests of the colonizers. Upon leaving, the colonial masters left behind the most inappropriate centralized governance systems, which continued to carry out policies and practices of internal colonialism towards all or of the non-titular ethnic or tribal communities. Implementation of such policies gradually resulted in politicization of cultural identities. That is, ethnic groups, politicization of ethnic identities, and transformed social cultural differences into articulated forms of social fragmentation, which with predictable disastrous consequences. Because earlier, all we had was differences. There was different groups living. Now they were fragmented through government policies and in fact brought into divisions, divided societies so that they fight. And this is the condition in which then the war is being in the war machine industrialized war machinery is being peddled essentially to these societies. Not surprisingly, most of these states and societies quickly became consumers of war, waged by despotic governments against their own people. Civil wars, so-called, or proxy wars, fought on the behest of foreign patrons within countries and between neighbors. It's such war and violence in post-colonial Muslim societies, instead of effecting better and more effective governments, ushering in peace and prosperity, contributed to fragmentation of societies and establishment of weak, fragile, and failed states. Brutal experiences of state instigated wars, internal colonialism, and violence destroyed or deformed traditional governing institutions of social control and conflict management in Muslim societies in the Middle East and Central Asia, without providing any kind of effective alternative to what was there. Therefore, the impact of long and short 20th century wars, and there are all kinds of other talks, uses, I don't want to get into that, but the long and short 20th century issue, in general, in the Muslim Middle East and Central Asia, that is the rest, in particular, has been massive, but substantially different from the reported dividends of war in Europe, Russia, and the United States. Since the Civil War, the United States of America, and after World War II, Europe and Russia have fought their wars almost exclusively outside of their own territories, and almost wholly in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and most recently in the Middle East and Southwestern Asia. That is, the producers of war and warfare technology, Western industrialized societies, have either fought their own low-intensity wars or instigated such wars in non-Western theater. These wars have continued to benefit the growth of Western military-industrial complex, while consistently victimizing the non-Western, especially Muslim societies. What is novel since World War II in American foreign policy, especially since the end of Cold War, according to Basevich, is the use and misuse of military force is the principal instrument of choice in foreign policy of the United States. Militarization of US foreign policy, especially in the Middle East, has intensified even further after September 11, 2001, attacks in New York and Washington, D.C., with unforeseen consequences for the region. It is this part that if I have time, I don't know how much time we have. We don't have much time. And the issue is really, there's a small little book. If anybody has not seen it, please look it up sometimes. It's written by a general from World War I called General Butler, Samuel or something, his first name Butler. And it's called War is a Racket. And indeed, war is nothing but a racket in much of the rest of the world. So I think I'm going to just summarize what I think you got the idea of what war has done in Afghanistan for the last 20 years is, again, creation of this divided society. I mean, the multi-ethnic society, which ethnicity has become highly politicized, and then every side has been essentially given weapons, so their weapon is given to them. Their even money and rations for food and everything else is provided to them, so that they are nothing but killing machines. That the entire conflict in this part of the world is that Western societies produce, they make the money, they employ people, they become creative, they improve their weapons, and they sell it and to both sides, so that they keep killing each other while more can be produced. And of course, there's statistics on how much the sales of weapons annually and what does that to the economies of the region. And places like Saudi Arabia, of course, have to buy $100 billion worth of metal that they used to kill Yemenis and all the rest. The story is quite familiar. And in a sense, my argument essentially is the war machinery in its history has helped the West and continues to help the West to both make money and to enjoy power. But its consequences and taking a war outside of these areas and fighting them as proxy wars elsewhere has essentially destroyed these societies. It does not help build them anything other than leaving societies in total mess and destruction. And the promises that are being made in justifying these wars, of course, was totally deceptive, false. And the sooner we come to realize that, or the sooner these societies come to realize, the better it would be for them. That war is not going to bring them anything but destruction and but disaster. But war continues to bring positive developments, because they're, even the weapons that the West is producing are being tested in these wars. The mother of all bombs, in 2018, America's largest bomb, conventional bomb, was tested in Afghanistan during Trump's administration. So this is, and the way that they can continue this kind of process is not by building democracy in those societies, but by building kleptocracy. They're not just only bringing these weapons, they actually throw money, cash, and pick up people from the society who are available for rent. So what we're having actually are not just these kleptocracies, these are also rented regimes. They're not rentier regimes. We have in the Middle East in general two kinds of them. Those that are rentier regimes, that they have resources that they're selling exclusively to the West, particularly those who have energy to sell. And then we have rented regimes. So rich countries are rentiers, and poor countries are turned into rented regimes. That we, in Afghanistan right now, we have introduced. We used to have actually a draft in Afghanistan. They did not adopt draft. So they are targeting to have 352,000 security force paid by America at the tune of $4 billion, so that America can withdraw its own troops, and then these troops have to fight the America's war there. So what you have is a formula for dependency forever. There is going to be no chance for Afghanistan ever to be able to free itself by having its own force that is affordable by itself, unless, of course, the policies change. And unless the American policies change, foreign policy change, and America's policy of war in the rest of the world changes, I think we're faced into a very, very grim future. And I'm not going to go any further. There are some more slides there. If you want to put, you can see some more numbers of casualties, costs, and all the rest. But I'm not sure what that's going to add, other than the fact that the war or fighting for democracy is the wrong kind of proposition. It has not produced anything positive or any dividend for the third world. And Afghanistan is simply one of the excellent examples. If war was going to do anything positive for a country, Afghanistan should be the greatest beneficiary of that, having been involved in a war for 41 years now. And it isn't. And America is not being honest with itself, with the people of Afghanistan, and with the people of the United States of America, particularly those Americans who actually believe in the rhetoric that is being presented by the United States, that they are out there helping, bringing liberty, development, democracy, and all the rest. And surprisingly, a lot of people here believe, because they don't really know or see what the true impact has been. All they see is $2 trillion have been spent there. But what has it done? For America, it has done a lot, and that they don't realize. some of the statistics that I wanted to sort of, if you want to run those things in the slides, fine. Yeah, the next one. I don't have control over it, it looks like. Can you go to the next slide? Okay, some of the numbers you can see, some 800,000 Americans have served in Afghanistan so far. 800,000 Americans have been at least once in that country during the last 20 years. And their US military is not the only ones who are there. There are probably as many, they're saying probably another 500,000 American civilians have been in Afghanistan during the war, profiting from the war there. And they're all under Pentagon contract of one sort or another. US deaths have been around 2,300, but there have been NATO deaths of over 1,000 as well. Some 20,000 Americans are seriously and grievously injured, and the cost of that is estimated around $1.4 trillion in the coming 40 years as they get older. Civilians have also died. These are American civilians. Almost 4,000 of them have died in Afghanistan so far. And cost to the Afghans, of course, nobody counts. We don't know. Nobody is really keeping the number of deaths. But what we know is last year, in 2019, 45,000 soldiers were killed. That we don't count the Taliban. Taliban are also Afghans as well. So how many of them died? Right now, 30 to 40 person a day dies in Afghanistan. Every day, 30, 40 person by war issues. And of course, displaced people, and over 5 million people, 2.1 million externally to Iran and Pakistan, and another 3.2 million internally within Afghanistan. Cities are bulging. In fact, every night, in the last few days, since the Taliban started their so-called peace talks, more people have been displaced in various provinces. And there's one other thing that America's development programs are also part of war. They're not part of peace. They're called humanitarian help. In fact, they're humanitarian wars. NGOs are part of the war, parts and parcel of the war. The Afghan government shows 5,184 listed NGOs operating in the country, and 278 of them are international. These are also funded to a large extent by American and other governments there, so that they are, this whole thing is part of the same war, a war for, not for democracy, the war for destruction and decimation of a culture, decimation of society and its possibilities. I don't know, is there any more of these slides, or this was the last one? The Taliban control. Taliban's supposed to be out of the picture, but the darker yellow ones are where they are totally in control. The lighter ones, they are contesting, and only the white areas are where the government has any control. So 19 years of war after defeating and then allowing and bringing this lunatic group into power. And of course, besides that, there are also Daesh, ISIS, a whole bunch of other organizations fighting in Afghanistan as well. And Al-Qaeda is still there because their second man in command was killed just 2 days ago in Afghanistan. Okay, the last one or two. Okay, those are the counter-narcotic $10 billion, $87 billion to train Afghan military and police force. And they only have 308,000 so far, but a lot of them are getting killed and they cannot replenish them. And there's also, those are numbers for which they get money from the United States, but a lot of them are ghost soldiers. They don't exist. People make up and get money for them and pocketed. And of course, economic development, they were talking about $24 billion. We don't know where that money went. I mean, there are some roads, but they're in terrible shape. Some schools, some colleges, and a few young people have learned something. Nobody can deny that there has been some small positive things. But given the amount of money spent, the amount of effort talked about, the outcome is really paltry. It's nothing. And another $30 billion on other kinds of construction. So you're talking about, 50-something billion in supposedly in reconstruction. But government's own inspector general for Afghanistan says $53 billion have been wasted, that they cannot account for it. Where did that money go? Nobody knows. Okay, I think this is not next to the last slide. So, and then I'll shut up. No? You can't see the last one? Okay. The additional cost to the United States, they're talking about this, much of this money that was spent, $1 trillion, $2 trillion in Afghanistan, was borrowed money. So the taxpayers have to pay the interest. So far, the interest paid is around $500 billion. And maybe to China, because a lot of those money is borrowed from Chinese banks and other things. And then $1.4 trillion is estimated to be the cost of veterans to be cared for, that 20,000 plus who have been seriously injured until 2059 is, again, this is the Brown University projection. The cost to American taxpayers would be $1.5 trillion to look after the veterans who were injured in the war in Afghanistan. So, okay, let us stop there and be happy to take questions. I know there's plenty of material in this to cover, and you can't cover it all in this kind of environment. But I hope I've given you something to think about.
Thank you very much, Professor Shahrani, for that provocative and illuminating talk. We do have some questions. So what I will do is call on you and unmute you, and you can ask your question yourself. We'll start with Vanessa Voss.
Oh, okay. All right, hello.
Hi, Vanessa.
Shahrani. So my question, I guess, is more of a philosophical question because that's what I do now. So could you comment on if there's any room for a just war, or if that's just a concept that we should get rid of, that there's no future in just war thinking?
I actually had a quotation on that issue in the paper. And the answer is no, there is no just war, and let's forget it. It's just whitewash.
So
war cannot be just, sorry.
Yeah, and so
Even
what would international, oh, sorry.
The only war that has been called good war is World War I, right? And then they made the World War II, I'm sorry, World War II is the Great War. And they're saying that war had some merit because it was against evil. The war was fought against evil, and the evil was really evil, is the way I think those who have written about it are saying. The cause, maybe there was some good in it, but not necessarily complete good in it. Yeah. But the fact that it was fought against evil is what made it justifiable.
Yeah. So I guess the follow-up to that I had was, what will, I guess, international justice, if it even makes sense to talk about that, look like without war? If I don't know if that's too big of a question, like how will international concerns be, or should they be addressed in the future?
Well, just or unjust, the war is not going to go away. But war is not the only means through which people could put pressure in society. There are other means. Look what they're doing to Iran, for example. Boycotting, doing all sorts of things, which are, I mean, there are other. the idea is the world has to come to think intelligently and creatively to come up with ways that would not involve violence. And we're not ready for that. Our first reaction is violence rather than thinking about other alternatives to settling disputes or issues.
Yeah. Right, thank you.
You're welcome.
The next question is from Shayar.
Okay, thank you, Professor Shahrani, for a very informative talk. I have a few questions, but I'm going to ask one because I want to give the opportunity to other ones. So based on what you were saying, latter part of your talk, would you also say that Syria is another example of Afghanistan, what's happening there? You know, all the countries are involved and why we are in it?
Yes, I have a paper, I don't know whether any of you have seen, on this notion of why politics of rage, why Muslim societies are in rage all the time. And I'm proposing there that the shape of colonial imperialism, I should say, has changed. We used to have empires of commerce in the very, first empires of faith, that people fought over religion and justified it over religion in these matters. Then Western Europeans started empires of commerce after industrialization, that they introduced, their finely produced industrial goods that needed to be marketed. So they took it through, say, East India Company to Indian subcontinent. And then once they got themselves there and made a lot of profits, that needed to be protected. So they then turned into empires of military empires of conquest, that they had to go and conquer it and hold it on. And people rose against that because it's very clear they are there, they are exploiting, they're extracting, they're doing all sorts of things. So that's what people rose up and fought, and came wars of liberation and then independence and so forth. After World War II, Europe changed the shape of empire. The empires came to be empires by invitation. America calls it empire of trust. What do? They find people in other societies where they can trust, and they recruit them through cash, through fear, through all sorts of things. And they create environments in other societies. Alternatively, if it's not by trust, or trust is part of it, it's by invitation, that no longer a Western society is willing to go and invade another country on its own. They have to be invited. They created conditions in those countries where they're invited, please, 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 please come. In 1998, 99, I was actually part of that inviting people. I was hoping America would go and invade Afghanistan, because the conditions in Taliban had created in the society was such that any intervention would be good. The Afghanistan invasions were by invitation. First, the communists invited the Russians, the Soviets, to come invade Afghanistan. And secondly, Taliban created a condition where America invited itself with the approval of the world. So you see, the situation now in the world is that where Western societies, I'm not just talking about earlier during the Cold War, it was capitalist socialist bloc. Each of them were essentially inviting societies to be on their side, on their bloc. And they were willing to give them money, and they were giving them ideology, giving them scholarships, all of this in the West. Now everybody is in the game. All people who have imperial ambitions are participating in the same thing. Chinese are doing it. Russians are doing it. Turks are doing it. And everybody is trying to use this soft peddling way of power to influence other societies and promote their own interests. So in the process, who gets lost, who gets smashed? The poorer societies. the less developed societies. So it has created a vicious circle. And this new imperial structure by invitation or empire of trust is very vicious because they do two things simultaneously. America has spent $1 trillion and a half or so for war, fighting, destroying. But at the same time, it has spent several $100 billion building hospitals, schools, scholarships, everything else. So you can tell. In the old days, it was just extraction. They extracted and didn't, give anything back. Now they're giving back and taking more. So it's a very different world in which we live. Like this structure and dynamics of this empire, new imperial system, that is part of the new so-called world order, is very disconcerting in the long run.
So Syria is a victim of this situation?
Syria is very much so. Syria invited Russia, for example, and Iran to come in its defense, because others meddled and created a condition where it could not defend itself, and it had to rely on others, but that's no defense. You, in fact, have given yourself to, one of the two sides. That are, both of them are not good for Syria. But the way the system works is that they force, essentially, societies to turn for help. Or they think they help, but in fact, it's no help. It's a greater threat.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Dan Enslow has a comment.
Hi, Dan. Your mic is closed. Okay. Your mic is still closed.
There we go. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Thank you for your insights and comments. It seems what you're calling at the end of your discussion was the need for a very deep planet-wide consultation and movement to move us away from the self-reinforcing system. And I appreciate that you're really focusing on the pain and anguish that it's causing outside this country, where we don't feel the full effects of what we're doing.
Right. Yeah, the war has become so remote, so digital, so other, that's virtually invisible. Americans, unless they are servicemen, has contracted to, work in the U.S. military and ended up in Afghanistan or any of these wars and got killed, and they come back. That family may know and feel something about it, but the rest of us don't. In Vietnam War, when I was here as a student, all students worried about being drafted, or somebody from their friends and things had been drafted in Vietnam fighting. And that made a huge difference. People fought, on the streets against the government, coming out of Vietnam. But now nobody cares. Okay.
Professor Shahrani, I was wondering if you could comment on current events in Afghanistan. There is a current peace conference ongoing. What will come of that, and what's the near future?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that one. Yes, there is supposedly a peace negotiation going on in Doha, Qatar. It was based on an agreement signed between Taliban and United States government. The person representing the United States is Zalmay Khalilzad. Some of you may or may know of him. He is an Afghan, like me, binational, and he is Republican, I'm not. And he has been working very, very closely with Republican governments during George Bush era. He was special envoy of the president to Afghanistan, and he messed up Afghanistan's constitution and even the initial government. He works as a tribesman, basically, for his own tribe. And he has his own tribal, minions as well as tribal opponents inside the country. So this was, and then he became Afghanistan's ambassador, US ambassador to Afghanistan, US ambassador to Iraq, and US ambassador to the United Nations, permanent towards the end of George Bush's thing. So he negotiated this agreement, and it has 4 parts. The first one was that the Taliban have to cut off their ties with Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations. Now they're not terrorists, you see. They are brought onto our side. They are willing to fight against ISIS for turf, essentially, nothing else. And the second thing was that they should reduce violence, which they haven't. They should not fight against American troops when they're getting out of Afghanistan. That they have done. They have not, in fact, attacked US or international forces. And I think only a few days ago, a couple of people from Norway or someplace got killed, but no American soldiers have been killed in the last 18 months, or no, 7 months in Afghanistan. So that was one of the other elements. And violence was to be reduced, which hasn't been reduced. And there's supposedly some clauses there that are not revealed. What exactly they are, we don't know. So, and that they should start negotiating with the Afghan government or with Afghan representatives on the other side. And they don't recognize the regime. They are saying the regime is, has no legitimacy, because in the last election, the president won by less than 900,000 votes, and all that's a usual thing, and with good sort of argument. But at any rate, they agreed to meet, and it started 40 days ago. The meeting started 40 days ago. They have not yet agreed on principles that would govern their negotiating process. Okay? They're insisting on 2 things. One, their agreement with the United States of America should be the basis of all negotiations that they would pursue. Okay? And the second thing is that the Sunni Hanafi madhab should be the basis for conducting the meetings. So if there are any issues, it has to be decided on the basis of Sunni Hanafi madhab. And of course, that means Shias have no place in there. And Shias are saying, it's not acceptable. And the current constitution of Afghanistan actually does not discriminate. Earlier constitutions did against the Shias. The current one doesn't. The current one recognizes both Hanafi and Jafari fiqh is legitimate. And Shias are, part of the society, completely integrated, and that they're not willing to. So the other side has been saying, well, let's not do the rely on American agreement with you. We have, in fact, government has several agreements with the United States government. Let's just use Quran and Hadith and not Hanafi fiqh. Let's just go to the fundamentals. So, you know, the whole point is that they're not willing to really do much of anything. Instead, they have increased war. There are 24, 25 different provinces in which every day there is war going on, and attacks, suicide attacks. You know, one of the really remarkable outcomes of the American wars in the last 20 years in that part of the Middle East has been suicide attacks, and is a means for fighting the war, which did not exist in the earlier wars. It was very limited. Now it is common every day. In Afghanistan, there are several different places where suicide attacks are staged and a lot of people are killed and so forth. So there is really not much of a hope for peace coming to Afghanistan anytime in the near future, as sadly as it may sound.
We have time for one last question. So Kutbetin Kilic, you have the floor.
Come on, Qutbuddin.
Yes. Merhaba, Professor Shahrani. Hi. Thank you very much for this insightful talk. And also, I want to say hi to Çiğdem Hanım. So yeah, it's good to see you, and Shahyar as well. By the way, hi from Dubai. I am in Dubai now. It's 1:23 a.m.
Okay.
in Dubai. So okay, my question.
Thank you for staying up.
Yeah, thank you. Professor Shahrani, you use this concept of war in a generic way, but in political science studies of war, they make a distinction between civil wars and interstate wars. Mm-hmm. So the argument is, with the end of the Cold War now, interstate wars are quite rare, if not non-existent. But my first question, if this distinction would make a difference in your analysis. The second one, also, I know that World Bank provides millions of dollars, like funding, for this leading some elite scholars from elite American universities, political scientists, and for developing some theoretical models that would predict the onset of civil wars, mm-hmm. especially in Africa.
Right.
And the reason behind this, project to just predict this onset of civil wars and find out these vulnerable societies and intervene in those societies even before those any potential civil wars break out. So it seems that World Bank doesn't like or doesn't want to have civil wars in Africa or in any other regions in the world. So this, how do you evaluate this situation?
That's very, very good questions. Both of them are very good questions. I think there is no war that could be termed as civil. It's just nonsense.
That's an internal
war,
versus
domestic war, and so forth. Yes. Yeah. There are two things that the new imperial system is doing. One is to stir up conflicts within states so that they become unstable, and then they would be invited. See, you may have political scientists have a definition of war, but one should also have a definition of what is that? It escaped me for a minute. I think my old age is catching up with me. The issue of interstate wars, right? Interstate war is something that they are not encouraging directly, although they did, say Iran and Iraq war, things like that. But they create threats. They create environment of threats in which countries have to engage in competitive buying of war machinery and arsenals. so that they can sell as much of their weapons as possible. And you can see Middle East is created, it's considered to be a very tense environment. And the tensions are produced, they are not there. There is consistent attempt at producing those tensions in the environment to get people to buy. But the other side is to create environment within states, particularly multi-ethnic states, particularly tensions between ethnic groups and so forth are increased, so that they can then sell weapons and create instability and do other things. On what World Bank does, my own feeling is that they're not doing any research to be able to predict civil wars, to prevent them, but rather study and anticipate and theorize about conditions where they could, when they need to, stir up civil wars. So it's not for prevention of civil wars, it's for creating civil wars is more likely to be the case. I know we academics are really not giving too much attention to what's going on in private think tanks and some of these major organizations that fund research and so forth, and how they make use of that information and that material. And my own hunch is that a lot of what we produce, we may not have control over, and that there are entities and organizations that are actually using it for unintended purposes, and purposes that is producing conflicts, both internal and between states. Between state wars have not been uncommon. I mean, Europe even had one, the Kosovo war and so forth, that was quickly settled because of where it's located. But other wars don't get that kind of treatment. And you'll see in the Middle East, there has been consistently expanding wars. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, and goes on. And who knows, maybe Iran, maybe Turkey. I mean, even the war now that is going on between Azerbaijan and Armenia, again, is another one of these things where it's not just the West. I mean, there are so many new participants in this game of empire by invitation, that Chinese are not far behind, and certainly Russians are right there, and even Indians or sometimes other powers in Europe, of course, the ones who had colonies in Africa have their own interests in middling in times and places where they choose to.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Shahrani. I'm afraid we're out of time.
Well, thank you.
If this were not a Zoom call, you would be able to hear the thunderous applause. You will have to imagine that. But we're very appreciative. Thank you also to the audience for attending today. And once again, if you'd like to join the Sesame email list, please drop me an email and I will get you added on. So once again, thank you, Professor Shahrani, and everyone, have a pleasant evening.
Thank you very much for everybody taking the time and being with us. I hope it was not too much of a waste of time for you guys. And I look forward to seeing you guys sometimes, inshallah, before too long. Take care and good evening.